Well, welcome, and I'm very pleased to see such a large audience. Can you hear me at the back quite clearly? Good, that's very good. I should apologise for speaking to you here in this town in English when everyone in the audience, I'm sure, is Romanian. But I'm afraid I could not stretch to more than a sentence in Romanian, so it will all be in English. Well, the reason that I am here is because, as Deodat mentioned, because of the furniture upstairs, which you'll hear more about later from my colleague Juliet Kinchin. And indeed, it was contemplating this furniture which drew my attention to what I would say is one of the dominant themes in the architecture and design of Central Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. And that is basically that there was immense importance attached to two interrelated concepts: the formation of a national style and the role that the folk arts would play in the creation of this style. Now, whether we're looking at the territories that now constitute the modern states of Poland, Slovakia, Czechia, Hungary or Romania, these factors, a national style and the folk arts of the region, are uppermost in our consideration. Now, you will see a lot of interesting and important design work today, especially in the talks by my two colleagues. But over the next few minutes, I'm going to focus not on the designers, but on the critical debates that gave a meaning to the folk arts. Basically, critics and theorists who framed the debate about the status of the folk arts in this region of Nagy-Magyarság or Romania Mare. Now, there are three stages that I want to concentrate on, and I define them as fieldwork, authenticity, and politics. And the first person I want to talk about is József Huska. Now, Huska was an amateur who published a number of works during the 1880s and 1890s that sought to draw a parallel between Hungarian medieval and Renaissance art and the ornamentation displayed by Hungarian folk craftsmen, claiming that both were of Eastern origin and specifically related to the decorative styles of Central Asia. Huska, as I've said, was an amateur in the best sense, and he adopted a range of techniques and methods, looking at aesthetic quality as well as distinctiveness to define his work. But the most important aspects for us are that he undertook extensive field work, visiting peasant communities across the kingdom, and he documented his findings either by acquiring mainly textiles but also ceramics and wood carvings, or else depicting the pieces in beautiful watercolours. And this is a watercolour on the right hand side of his studies after the embroideries on the male sewer shepherd's coat. Now, Huska's repertoire of designs established a reliable basis on which metropolitan designers could adapt and deploy patterns and motifs from the folk arts in a variety of contexts, often far removed from their place of origin or original purpose. This inaugurated a period in Hungarian design policy that could be defined specifically by the role of the folk arts. We can see this across a huge range of objects, buildings and such like. Perhaps the most famous would be the Iparnuvezeti Museum, which was slated to be finished in time for the Millennial Exhibition of 1896. And looking round this building, now unfortunately in a very sad state, but in its original state and until recently replete with a range of patterns and ornamentation derived from folk textiles. But it was more than simply decoration. If one looks, for example, at the Millennial Village of 1896, which was part of the millennial celebrations, one can see the beginning of the use of peasantry as symbolizing the Hungarian peoples. And likewise, this carried on when one looks at the exhibits that represented Hungary at the Paris 1900 exhibition, the beginning of what one colleague has described as an international style offensive to define Hungary in comparison and alongside many other countries represented in the exhibition. But perhaps the most explicit reference to this use of the folk arts as symbolizing the culture and nature of the Hungarian peoples is that produced for the St. Louis exhibition of 1904, where we can see in the bottom right, the actual installation and of the exhibition by the Hungarian designer Pál Horthy, but more than that, in the depiction of Hungarian life in a mural by Aladár Korosfoy Kris, which was translated as Going to Church in the Kalotaszeg. That region to the east of where we are now, between here and Cluj, which was taken by many to be the cradle of a certain type of folk arts or a tradition of folk arts that seemed to be, to many of these theorists, emblematic of Hungarian culture and identity. Now, as well as numerous public, religious and private buildings, one can see this use of pattern ornamentation throughout a range of settings. And whether this is objects like the Postal Savings Bank by Odon Lechner, the Reformed Synagogue in Subotica by Komor and Jakob, right over to Bela Laita's commercial school, and indeed in the villas of Josef Vago, the designer of the house in which we're sitting at the moment. You can see this again, this transmigration of motifs from embroideries, ceramics and wood carvings into tile work and even into concrete. Now, to many foreign visitors to Hungary at this time, especially designers, especially designers in the English arts and crafts tradition, it was this apparently thriving medium of the folk arts that was the most distinctive feature of modern Hungary. The English designer Charles Robert Ashby, one of the leading figures in the generation after William Morris, had several Hungarian clients, and he wrote on Hungarian design in the Times in 1905. And this is him on the Budapest Ethnology Museum. To the artist, this exhibition of classified handicraft was particularly instructive, but the special interest lay in the fact that it was still alive. Peasant crafts still actually in existence. I believe that with the possible exception of Russia, Hungary is the only European country where this still obtains. Now, this is a piece of nonsense, but it was very persuasive, and it certainly began a tradition of discussing Hungarian peasant craft, or the peasant crafts of this region in the Danube Basin, as somehow a living tradition which rejuvenated itself constantly. Now, Ashby got acquainted with what might be regarded as the next generation of field workers after Huska. And the main figure in this was Malonyai, then working on his great book series, The Art of the Hungarian People, which was produced in 5 volumes between 1907 and 1921. This was a massive project in which many younger artists, designers and intellectuals participated. It was a great influence on the emerging national romantic style, and designers like Ede Tureckai-Wigand and Károly Kós, whom you'll be hearing more of from Anthony later. But also it stimulated a taste for collecting examples of the folk arts to be displayed in the homes of the educated bourgeoisie of Budapest. I'm sorry, I've gone too far ahead of myself. Here we are, objects collected. And it, in turn, provided a repertoire of motifs which could be adapted for different purposes. This is a famous example, the wooden grave posts from Transylvania, which were drawn up by Aladar Iles, but adapted in the centre in a chair by Tureckai-Wigand, or on the right in a pew end in a church by Károly Kós. Now, the next major foreign tourist to comment on all this is Walter Crane, who famously had a big exhibition in Budapest in 1900. At that time, Walter Crane was probably the greatest exponent and certainly the most important figure in the English arts and crafts movement, arguably the inheritor of the great tradition of William Morris. And Crane visited Hungary and repeated many of the prevailing views on the folk arts. As he wrote at the time, "Nothing can surpass the beauty of some of the needleworks and the patterns from embroidery and the loveliness of traditional peasant stitchworks, increasing the colour effect of the costume. There is the characteristic Hungarian feeling in everything." Now, while Walter Crane is saying and writing this, there was a problem entering this whole discourse, because the status and meaning of the folk arts were being questioned as to what was the nature of authenticity or authentic folk arts. And indeed, a few years later, in 1907, when Walter Crane came to write his reminiscences, he had this to say: "Schools of embroidery were being established in the towns to teach the work which the peasantry had taught themselves. And at every remove, the patterns became tamer. It does not seem possible to transform unconscious, spontaneous art into conscious, learned art, any more than it is possible for wild flowers to flourish in a formal garden." It's quite a poetic way of describing this, but he's raising questions about what is authentic and what might be regarded as somehow artificial or compromised in the folk arts. Now, what Crane is describing here is the difference between the folk arts and the home industries. And these already preceded Walter Crane's arrival, because as early as the 1880s, Mrs. Gyarmati had been organising home industry projects, or házi ipar. But the management and interpretation of the folk arts and the metropolitan crafts inspired by them were gradually being taken over and shaped by government policy and institutions. The so-called schools of embroidery that Walter Crane was referring to, these are now part of a government policy rather than a native indigenous tradition. So what we can see increasingly is established designers like Paul Horty or Istvan Gro beginning to incorporate motifs and forms from the folk arts, but objects which are now sold to a metropolitan bourgeoisie to be displayed alongside modern furniture and such like. Now, we can see something of this in the examples I'm showing you there, but it becomes yet more systematized with the creation of teaching materials, myntalopog, pattern books, which are used in studios and in colleges throughout Magyar Ország. This is a watercolour prepared by Toroczkai Wiegold, which many of these were produced as printed sheets and marked up with dimensions so that they could be very easily adapted for training. And at its most extreme, this also related to the establishment of the craft colony at Gödöllő outside Budapest, because it was actually part of a government policy to close down the weaving workshop at Torontal and move the looms to Gödöllő so as to centralize this production of approved craft material. And indeed, this became a central feature of the community. Now, this problem between authenticity and the true, shall we say, the true folk arts as opposed to the home industries becomes deeply immersed in also a political context. And one of the strongest critics of this is the Viennese art historian Alois Riegel. Now, Riegel is probably best known nowadays as one of the great founders of art historical methodology. But he was, to begin with, a curator of textiles and both acquired and developed techniques for the interpretation of folk textiles as well as court and other materials. He wrote a text called Volkskunst, Hausfleisch and House Industry, loosely translated, and my German's not great, but shall I just say it's the folk arts, domestic products and home industry. Home industry being what we call in English the putting out system, where this is farmed out for production in villages. Now, Riegel's thesis in this text is that the economic conditions supporting an authentic folk art no longer existed. In fact, Riegel stands out as a true modernist in this. He has no time for what he calls the bourgeois pieties of the folk arts. In fact, he talks about it at one stage as folk art is like a precious, fragile flower, a blue flower, invoking a secret knowledge too ineffable to survive the harsh glare of reason. Now, that little poetic description of the folk arts is his preamble to saying the folk arts are a bourgeois creation for metropolitan elites to pretend that they are linked to a deeper, longer tradition. Riegel is a rather bracing theorist who basically clears the ground and says the folk arts are an illusion which the bourgeoisie keep going. Now, you don't have to accept that, but it's certainly a corrective to much of the other discussion about this so-called living tradition of the folk arts as part of modern life. Now, actually, Riegel did acknowledge that there was life in the folk arts of Transylvania, and he went on to provide an anecdote about a peasant woman who, although poor and used to selling and bartering, refused to sell an item of embroidered clothing because she had invested not only cloth and skilled labour in the blouse, but also her imagination. And I think this is a really interesting interpretation of the folk arts, because he goes on, she imagined the future life of the object. She made the object well because she was able to imagine it throughout its lifespan. who would use it and where it would be used and when. All this she envisaged and then over time experienced. To sell or even to exhibit the blouse to perfect strangers was to forego or diminish the pleasure she would receive from imagining the life of this object she had created. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at the folk arts, but it doesn't change the fact that for Regal, the folk arts were an anachronism, and the sooner they were cleared out of the realm of our consumption, the better, and then we could face up to the realities of life. Now, Regal was very dogmatic on this, adopting a severely modernist position. But there was a lot of interesting and useful work undertaken at Gödele. I can't help thinking of Regal when I see these pictures of Mariska Undi at her holiday home in the Kalottaseg, dressed as a peasant, as opposed to her back in her bourgeois apartment in Budapest, dressed in fairly chic contemporary clothing. So we get some sense of that, I think, here. But there was nevertheless some interesting work produced that even Regal was prepared to acknowledge. And we can see some of it in the works of Wiegand in Gödele, which was more than just producing knickknacks for the bourgeoisie. He also went out to design rural churches, well, more schools, housing and public buildings, which did help to alleviate the poverty and the conditions of the rural peasantry. And indeed, it did produce some major projects, famously the Palace of Culture in Marosvásárhely, which was the interior of which was largely decorated, designed and made up by the designers in Gödele. Now, it's basically at this point in 1911 where we move from questions of authenticity to questions of politics, because it was at this point that Aladar Korosvoi Krish produced one of the early manifesto statements about this condition of the folk arts in the Studio magazine in London. Now, the Studio was not just a local British magazine. By 1900, this had become the most important design magazine internationally. So in 1911, when Korosvoi Krish is choosing to write on the Hungarian folk arts, he's doing so in the knowledge that he's speaking to an international readership, far beyond simply the English arts and crafts people. And indeed, what he's writing about, oh, I'm sorry, have I? Yeah, here we are, is trying to give an interpretation of the distinctive character of Hungarian folk arts, where he says, and today it would seem to be impossible to distinguish by any method known to positive science that artistic manifestations and products of the Hungarian genius from those of other nations. And yet, every one of us who travels through the country with open eyes feels convinced that there is a Hungarian national style, however much it may be furrowed and intersected by influences derived from other sources. I don't mean to be too harsh on Korosvoi Krish, but there's absolutely no foundation for any of this. It's an attempt to define something without any evidence. When he uses terms, it says, every one of us who travels through the country with open eyes feels convinced that there is a Hungarian national style. Well, he was writing at a time when the concept of a Hungarian national style was deeply compromised, because in the same year that he wrote this text, there was published the ethnographic map of the larger Hungary, which you can see there, when in fact, but even by this stage, the Hungarians were in a minority. And it was very important, therefore, to identify the Hungarians as opposed to what he called the other sources. Now, we're only one short step away, of course, from the First World War, the end of which, and the so-called Treaty of Trianon, which led to the dismemberment of the Kingdom of Hungary and the creation of a range of successor states. I often use this picture because my students used to laugh at it. It's very amusing. It's a piece of Hungarian irredentist propaganda about the reunification of Hungary. And as an example of how the British might feel about it, they gave a view of what would happen to Britain on the bottom right-hand side. The irony of this is that most people now in Scotland would like to be in Norway, certainly since Brexit, but it gives you some indication really of the way that the Hungarians were keen to communicate in a very direct local manner of what was happening. Now, what comes after this, therefore, is a considerable recalibration of what is a national style in the successor states. And one of the keys to this is in the writings of the French art historian Henri Faucillon, who I think after Émile Malle was probably the greatest French art historian of the 20th century. And Faucillon organised, or was one of the contributors to, the first international scholarly Congress on the art populaire, held in Prague in October 1928, under the aegis of the League of Nations. Now, the two-volume conference proceedings, published in 1931, give us essays on various aspects of it, but Faucillon was invited to write the introduction, to provide an overview as to what the folk arts might be in the 1920s. And this is where he, like Riegel and others before him, became a little bit poetic, where he writes, "A hidden instinct allows the marvel of a beautiful dream to inhabit the poorest material. Within the tightest extended thread, the strictest human definition, whimsy, reverie, love and gift remain in play. The proper frame of reference for folk art can therefore never be national and ethnic." And indeed, he goes on to say quite explicitly, the principle of nationalities tends to accentuate differences, leading each political group to glorify its own ancient heritage of traditions as an excessive asset, like some original value. Now, you might imagine that this is a corrective, criticising the previous nationalistic and ethnically driven definitions of the folk arts. But it didn't die out, because although the Hungarians felt embattled in this period, this was the context of the Little Entente and the successor states, each of whom wanted to assert that they had a national style based on their folk arts. The curious thing for me in all of this is that Faucillon's protege and collaborator was George Oprescu, professor in the University of Bucharest, and indeed the founder of the Institute for Art History in the Romanian Academy. And given his opportunity to write on Romanian folk arts for the same studio magazine that Weygand, Krisch had written for, rather than adopt Faucillon's ideal of suppressing national tendencies, Oprescu went on the offensive and emphasised that there are distinct features of the folk arts in Transylvania which are uniquely Romanian. And indeed, when he put them forward, there is a descriptive or naturalistic tendency in Hungarian art linked to a sensory approach originating in the East, whereas the Romanians have an abstract tendency, which is a function of the mind more given to abstraction. Now, writing this in the late 1920s was akin to saying that the Romanians are more attuned to abstraction, the most progressive form of contemporary avant-garde art, whereas the Hungarians are still stuck in representational art. There's no basis for any of this. And indeed, it demonstrates that despite Faucillon's sincere attempts to take politics and national identity out of the equation, not many people in the successor states were prepared to accept it. And in fact, Oprescu went so far as to select examples from Transylvanian folk arts which he felt exemplified the Romanian tendency towards abstraction, which you can see here. The other element which he saw in Romanian folk arts, which I thought was even worse, he says that the Romanians have a particular flair for colour. Now, I don't know how you would assess that, but he went on to select a range of folk arts which used quite intense, deeply soaked colour, which you can see here. And indeed, he argued for what he called the continuity of soul and outlook, seeing Romanian love of colour as an ancient inheritance born of an intimacy with nature and expressed by peasant art through the centuries. Now, what Oprescu was attempting to do, because at the same time he wrote this piece, he was beginning to write the first history of Romanian painting and sculpture, where he wanted to emphasize that there was a continuity between the Byzantine and folk traditions and Romanian modernity that justified modern culture. So he was, in a sense, selecting the source material to prove the continuity, not so dissimilar from the Daco-Roman continuity theory of modern Romanian culture. Now, this merely demonstrates, as I've said, the extent to which the folk arts have been exploited, manipulated, and indeed deployed in arguments which have very little to do with the production of those goods in their own right. But before I end on a rather depressing note of cynicism and overt manipulation of the source material, there is one person whom I would point to who emerges from this, I think, as a genuine scholar and serious interpreter of the folk arts, someone who was involved in Malonyai's art of the Hungarian peoples, but was also involved in the Prague conference on the folk arts, and this is Bela Bartók. And Bartók wrote at the time and subsequently, from the very beginning, I have been amazed by the extraordinary wealth of melody types existing in the territory under investigation in Eastern Europe. As I pursued my research, this amazement increased. In view of the comparatively small size of the countries, the variety in folk music is really marvellous. Rather than seeking to divide or select, Bartók sees it as a vast repertoire of forms, all of which is of equal value and worth interpretation. And this is Bartók with his outfit for going on fieldwork trips throughout Eastern Europe and indeed into Anatolia at different times, when he says, what can be the reason for this wealth? Comparison of the folk music of these peoples made it clear that there was a continuous give and take of melodies. It is obvious that if there remains any hope for the survival of folk music, any walls to separate peoples from each other bodes no good, and a complete separation from outside influences means stagnation. Well assimilated, foreign impulses offer possibilities of enrichment. For Bartók, The folk arts should be a continuing presence and inspiration for modern life, but it's proved to be very difficult to keep politics and national identity out of this equation. Thank you.